I'm delighted today to be joined by Vespucci Maritime founder, Lars Jensen. Now, Lars has 25 years of experience from inside the container shipping industry. And this covers a combined period of 8 years as director of driving and developing market intelligence and analysis for Maersk Line, Maersk Logistics, and the container ship company. Additionally, and in really the last 2 years of his time at Maersk, Lars was CEO of the purely online container carrier U-Ship, as well as in charge of developing and implementing digital strategy in Maersk Line. Lars co-founded Sea Intelligence in 2011 and later founded Sea Intelligence Consulting in 2013. And in 2021, Sea Intelligence Consulting changed its name to Vespucci Maritime. And prior to entering the container shipping industry, Lars completed a PhD on complex mathematical analysis and physics, as well as work with technological innovation and modeling in the oil and gas industry, and also close relationship with the Copenhagen Business School, who we're also delighted to be featuring in these podcasts as well. Lars, have I got your bio correct there? And if I have, welcome. Tell me where maybe I need to add a bit more, but everything okay?
Everything okay, and you've already listed far more than I usually do. I usually just say to people, I'm just a guy trying to make sense of what happens in container shipping.
Oh, yeah, well, absolutely. Well, there's a lot happening in container shipping at the moment. Just really before we go into the meat of what we're going to talk about, you say on your website the line of shipping will undergo dramatic transformation in the next decade. What do you mean by that? How do you see line of shipping transforming or developing or changing in the next 10 years?
There are multiple elements that goes into it. I would point to two of the major ones. One is a demographic shift. The other one is AI. And the demographic shift, I think most are severely underestimating what that's going to mean for container shipping. In container shipping, we are so used to thinking that the East-West trades, Asia-Europe, Asia-North America, the transatlantic, that's simply the backbone of everything else that we do. But if you look ahead for the coming decades, the demographic growth in population, that is Africa, Middle East, India, and subcontinent. And if you add on top of that the expected economic development, the vast majority of growth in container shipping is going to be across the Asian-African region, not the usual East-West trades. That will fundamentally change how our networks are going to operate.
Is container shipping going to be able to react as quickly as it needs to react? Because you talked about a massive change in infrastructure there.
Oh, I mean, container shipping has always been able to react quickly, so I have no doubt that that's what's going to happen here as well. I see the next, I would say, 5 years into the early 2030s as a period where a lot of the major liner shipping companies will be jockeying for position in terms of this new game that's going to be afoot. What is potentially missing is development, especially of port infrastructure, logistics infrastructure, especially in Africa, but also to quite a degree on the Indian subcontinent. Is that where it should be right now if we look ahead 20 years? No, absolutely it's not. But am I confident we're going to see those developments? Yes, I am.
And what about new players in the marketplace? I mean, are we dealing with the same sort of established liner shipping companies, high cost of entry into this market? Or would you start to see new players coming in?
Depends on which end of the spectrum you're looking at. If we're looking at the large global carriers, that is highly unlikely to change. The level of consolidation we see amongst the 8 to 10 largest container lines right now makes it nigh on impossible for any newcomers to come in and take a meaningful position there. Furthermore, I would expect the liner shipping downturn we're likely going to see in 27, 28 will further consolidate the market with quite a few of the smaller regional niche carriers then being acquired by the large ones. That doesn't prevent newcomers from coming in. You are likely going to see more local niche carriers try their luck as some of these niche markets grow. Even in a highly contested field, you will still be able to find niche opportunities. But will we see the emergence of a new large global player that doesn't exist today? I find that very doubtful.
There with the anticipated downturn, presumably linked to the new orders coming out of yards by that stage with increase in tonnage.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I don't think no matter how we slice and dice it, we are going to run into a cyclical downturn with the bottom being 27, 28. I'm not prone to big headlines, so I would most certainly not call this a disaster because it is not. A disaster would be like the financial crisis in 2009, but that's not what we're looking at as a baseline. But let me then put a caveat on there, because if we've learned anything over the last 6 years, we should never underestimate what sudden black swans are going to appear on the horizon and upset the apple cart completely. Nobody saw the pandemic disruptions before they happened. The outlook from everyone was also a downturn in 2024 because of overcapacity. And just as we were entering 24, we saw the eruption of the Red Sea crisis, completely absorbing that overcapacity and turning 2024 from an overcapacity situation to a capacity shortage situation. God knows whether we're going to see more black swans. We could always speculate what's going to happen, say, in Taiwan or the South China Sea. But if we look much closer to basically where we are talking right now, what would be the fallout of the war in the Middle East? Is this going to taper off and that's it? Or is this going to escalate to something even more dramatic than what we're seeing right now? We just don't know.
Maybe coming on to that first point of geopolitics and certainly the Iran situation, the first time, in a number of years, geopolitics has shipping bang at the center of everything that's happening, whether it's Venezuela or Red Sea, as you say, or potentially China and Taiwan, and now with Iran and the effective closure of the Straits of Hormuz. The interesting thing that, I pick up when I listen to the news in the morning, and you hear about the attacks on vessels, is the fact that container ships are getting attacked. These are container ships that are maybe sitting alongside further up the Gulf. What's your take on what's going on at the moment in the Middle East Gulf? It's a very, very unstable situation. It's a very uncertain situation. Trump is talking about it, we're near in the end. He's running out of targets to hit in Iran. Iran still seems to be sending even more missiles and drones and attacking its near neighbors to try and put pressure on the US. What's your take on it all?
Yeah, my take on this one is, and this might then be cheered on by some of the audience and by others saying this is absolutely not the case, but I see the eruption of an almost predictable problem. We see a US go in apparently with a plan that if you just bomb out the leadership, you will have won the war. And if we look at the US approach to doing this across the Middle East for decades, that approach has never really worked. And there was no reason to believe it would work this time either. What I see is the unfolding of a strategy on the part of the Iranian leadership. And this is not to heap any kind of praise on the Iranian leadership. I don't think that the Iranian population is well off with that kind of leadership. Let's put it that way. But if we park that one for a second, given the conflict, the Iranian leadership militarily could not hope to play even up with the Americans. That's pretty clear. But they have likely also learned from all of the different American wars in past decades. The Americans are very poor at fighting an asymmetric war. And that's exactly what the Iranians are turning this into. Rather than go head on with the US military, Iran is instead broadening this out to be a regional conflict. So far, we got 14 different countries directly involved, and they're turning this into a global economic warfare as well. They are impacting, as you were mentioned, also container ships. We saw an attack on an oil depot outside the major container transshipment hub in Salalah outside the Gulf just yesterday, causing one of the more important container ship imports for now to have suspended their operations. They have effectively seized all transport through the Strait of Hormuz, creating massive upwards pressure on the oil price. What all of this translates into is when you're impacting all of the world's supply chains, this hurts a very, very wide array of countries around the world. And what will these countries then logically do? They will look for, how can we stop this? And none of these countries seems to be yearning to join a war against Iran, leaving the only one option left, put pressure on the US to stop it. And that goes back to the whole premise I started with here. If you're looking at the strategic options available to the Iranian regime, this is probably the one where they have the highest chance of success. So from that perspective, I don't see an end to this anytime soon, at least not if the expectation is that the Iranians are going to give up.
Do you think, press reports this morning, oil price went over to, 108 down to 98. It's fluctuating. It's kangarooing, I think they called it now.
Yes.
It's quite an interesting term. But, Iran wants it to get up to $200 a barrel. As you say, that's going to have massive impact right the way across the board on all supply chains, all products, all the rest of it. And Trump could turn around and declare anything a victory.
Yes.
He can stop at any time. It's whether Iran wants to stop it. How do you see this panning out? You're right in what you're saying with the strategy coming out of Tehran and with the Revolutionary Guard and what they're doing. But how do you see it ending? How do you see it
Yeah,
being
I would tend to agree with your sentiment there as well. I mean, if we are looking for a short-term solution, there is only one. And that one would be Trump coming out and declaring victory. No matter what the reality on the ground is, Trump coming out, declaring victory and stopping the bombing. And by the way, he would need to convince Israel to go along with the same path of stopping the attacks. That, as I see, is the only short-term solution right now. You could then argue, could we then continue with a war of attrition? There's been plenty of argument out there that the Iranians are going to run out of missiles and drones. I don't think anybody has a good count on how many missiles and drones they have. Maybe a much poorer comparison, but these were the kind of arguments we also heard early on in the Red Sea crisis. And what we learned from the Red Sea crisis in terms of shipping the last few years is you don't need to shoot at everything that moves in order to deny somebody else access to a body of water. You just need to shoot every so often so the risk is sufficiently high that commercial ships don't really want to run the risk. So Iran doesn't need to keep up the tempo of attacks we've seen over the last 12 days. They just need to keep up enough of a tempo to maintain a credible threat.
I think it was about a week and a half ago, Ember Ecos came into the market and two of their VLCCs were taken on charter for $700,000 a day.
Yeah.
Going into the Gulf, which is double the record. I think it's 438,000 or something was a previous record. There's a well-known saying that, whenever you have a crisis or a global crisis or a war, shipping benefits because freight rates go through the roof.
That's perfectly true. I mean, if you look specifically on my core expertise over on container shipping, the pandemic financially was the best thing that ever happened to container shipping.
Yeah.
You saw for a couple of years, the container shipping companies on a margin level were more profitable than tech companies in Silicon Valley. And that was following a 20-year period where the container lines were perpetually loss-making. So it definitely is true that these crises tend to cause carriers to make money. Just to be clear, the only reason they're making money is because crisis tends to restrict capacity and thereby change the whole supply-demand equation.
But shipping is very quick, very agile in adapting, isn't it, to crisis?
Yeah, it is. I think if you're going to look for something that's quicker, then it would be air freight.
You mentioned briefly there the China-Taiwan situation. We've got the Russia-Ukraine conflict going on that is not getting into the papers at the moment because everybody's talking about Iran. But you've got China and Taiwan. What do you think the sort of strategy, China's strategy here is on that? Because, I mean, if you want a game changer, that's going to be a game changer. It's going to affect the global economy massively. Do you think China is just going to bide its time because it knows eventually Taiwan will become part of China? Or will it use this state of uncertainty and the fact that, America's, preoccupied with a war at the moment in the Middle East to maybe make a move? What are your thoughts on that?
My thoughts, and they've been for many years, is I see a China that has an interest in making everybody believe an invasion of Taiwan is almost imminent. Because by having everybody believe that, you're tying up especially a lot of U.S. military resources just in case. For the same reason that it's in China's interest that we have a constantly unstable North Korea, because that ties up a lot of U.S. military interests in South Korea. I don't see a China, and I know there are plenty of people that say otherwise out there, but I don't see a China that is imminently going to invade Taiwan. They are plenty preoccupied in what I tend to call the colonization of Africa, which they have almost completed. They are rolling out their economic influence across large parts of Asia, increasingly Latin America as well. They got plenty of other things to do, but maintaining that threat over towards both Taiwan and, for that matter, in North Korea simply ties up resources that cannot be used to counter China anywhere else. With respect to China, what I do begin to fear that we're seeing the stages of is a whole different crisis involving China. That relates to Panama. Because if we look back over what has happened in the past little bit over a year, what I see beginning here was initially you had a U.S. President Trump that had all sorts of arguments that were founded in nothing, saying that China controlled the Panama Canal and the U.S. wanted control back over the Panama Canal. A quick solution was found. I mean, what the U.S. was looking at were the two Hutchison-operated terminals in Panama. Now, Hutchison is a private Hong Kong-based company, but in the eyes of the U.S., apparently that was Chinese influence. That appears to be solved quickly by a sale of the two terminals to MSC and BlackRock. Unfortunately, in recent months, that deal then fell through, thereby the political problem once again erupted. In Panama, the Panamanian Supreme Court then made a ruling that the basis upon which the tender was given to Hutchison was illegal. So Hutchison was stripped of the two terminals they otherwise were operating in Panama. That caught the ire of China. China has basically already been out saying there will be a price to be paid, but in usual Chinese term, keeping it completely vague in terms of what that actually means. Next step was that Panama appointed APM Terminals and MSC to operate one terminal each for an interim period over the next 18 months until the terminals can then be set up on a new permanent tender. Fast forward to this week, where a few days ago, news was coming out from the Chinese ministry that they had called in Maersk and MSC for discussions of trade-related nature. That's all the information we have. And if I look at the popular press, there was a lot of writings that this was because China didn't want the carriers to increase freight rates as much as they did during the Hormuz crisis. I'm not buying that. Because if this was about increased freight rates, China would have called in all the carriers. We've seen that before. They did it in September 2020, for example. So calling in only Maersk and MSC. To me, that is a large red flag that this is about Panama. And what they've told Maersk and MSC, we don't know. Neither Maersk nor MSC is saying anything. Of course, China would have a lot of pressure points they could lever against large global companies. But all in all, what this paints to me is that the geopolitical conflict between US and China over the Panama Canal is only beginning. And what I would not be surprised to see as one of the next steps over the next couple of years might be a rekindling of the idea of building a Nicaragua canal. This has been on and off the table for 150 years. More interestingly, it was on about 10 years ago, where seemingly Chinese consortium was always a little bit unclear who, was already in the process of building a Nicaragua canal. And when I was looking at it, I was actually over there visiting them in connection with this so-called canal project. And I left over there with the feeling that this simply doesn't add up, because from a commercial perspective, there was no good business case at all. A couple of years later, two events happened. In my mind, they're linked, but I can, of course, not prove that. It might be pure coincidence. But you had the Panamanian government come out officially and say they no longer recognize Taiwan as a country. And then also the Nicaragua Canal project disappeared. And that is my hypothesis that this is Chinese pressure. Because if you build the Nicaragua Canal, that will have a devastating economic impact on the Panama Canal. And given the current beginning tension over the Panama Canal between US and China, I would not be surprised to see China rekindle the Nicaragua Canal project. And if it's not resolved, I could actually also see them build it this time around. Because from a Chinese perspective, they might then concern that the US holds too much sway over a vital waterway like the Panama Canal. So much in the vein of what they're doing with their Belt and Road strategy, they might also say, we want a canal that we have control over across the Central America.
And to be honest with you, I mean, Trump's, proclamation or declaration that he wants to take over the Panama Canal a year and a half ago was because he wants to take that control away from China. And you can see the logic there from the Chinese.
You can see the logic from the Chinese. You can say what kicked this whole thing off. Trump's argumentation, I don't see very much logic in. Trump's argumentation was that China controlled the canal because they had two terminals. Let's be honest here. There are 5 terminals in Panama, the largest of which is actually an American terminal operator. Then you have 2 from Hong Kong, one at either end. One of the arguments being used was because you had one at either end, you could somehow use those terminals to block the canal. And the folly of that argument is easy to see. I don't need a terminal to block a canal. Then I would just charter a 25-year-old bulk vessel loaded up with cement and sink it in the middle of the canal or something similar. You don't need a terminal to wreak havoc, obviously.
Going back to what you were saying earlier about the transformation of the liner sector over the next 10 years. And you mentioned Africa there. You've also mentioned, massive investment by China in Africa as well. Are you going to be seeing over the next 10 to 20 years even more of a dominance of China in these trades? I mean, it's got its Belt and Road initiatives. And, we've seen it invest in even countries in the Caribbean like Jamaica, massive amounts of investment in there. But is China going to start, through a stealth way, I suppose, start to play more of an important controlling role through its investments in key areas, growth areas like Africa?
From my perspective, in Africa, the game is almost up. I mean, this is the game China has been playing for the last 25 years. China already controls an enormous array of logistics infrastructure, of natural resource extraction throughout most of the African countries. The only larger players that to some degree are getting in and getting in on a part of the action, that is, for example, some of the Saudi investment funds that we're seeing. The investments and the control, you can say, from US, from Europe, is modest, to put it mildly. So in terms of Africa, I see a game that is basically up already. Where China's focus appears to be shifting towards is widening its reach across Asia, and most importantly, Latin America. So South America, Central America, and the Caribbean. And that's, of course, where geopolitical interests will again begin to clash with, for example, the US.
Okay, Lars, I want to touch on a couple of extra points here before. I want to talk a little bit about AI, and then I want to talk about the Copenhagen Business School, because I know you've been involved through that, really. But artificial intelligence, goodness me, I mean, over the last 4 or 5 years, how digitalization has accelerated in the global shipping industry. Shipping was always said to be, catching up other industries who are way ahead, like aviation and what have you. And, there's comments from leaders within the industry that, it's not going to have any impact on jobs because we still need people, and then digitalization needs people as well. What's your views on AI and the impact that AI will have on shipping? Shipping always strives for greater efficiency. It needs to narrow that gap between the massive fluctuation in freight rates. So it needs to drive an efficiency. How do you see it panning out with AI at a macro shipping industry level?
Yeah, you can say at a macro level, AI is going to take over a lot of the more tedious administrative issues. It's going to take over a large part of, you can say, what is typically your tendering process or your request for quote processes, quite a bit of the customer service processes. We got an enormous amount of people involved in this, and a lot of that will be taken over by AI. With that being seen, AI is not the panacea that will do anything and everything. Let's take a few of the things where I don't see AI making much of a difference. There are these thoughts that we are going to get completely autonomous ships, and the answer to that is both yes and no. I don't see that we get autonomous ships run by AI across the Pacific, for example. Not because we can't, we can, but because a ship is a large physical thing that tends to break. And if you have something that physically breaks in the middle of the ocean, it is a lot easier to fix it if you got skilled crew on board than if you don't. So there's simply a cost element. You're definitely going to see more autonomous ships operating close to shore. So very short hauls, small ferries, small barges, that eventually will be more and more autonomous and also run by AI. Because there you could just send somebody out in a small boat, get on board and fix whatever needs to be fixed. But then there are also other elements. Sometimes it's also argued that you can do a lot of the legal filing. I would be hesitant in believing that to a large degree, because I think a lot of people forget that AI is actually not intelligent at all. It's just a statistical model. That's what it is. Huge statistical model, and it looks at all points in time, what is the most likely answer here? But when that is then met up with legal documents don't work in statistics. They work in absolutes. Either you can do this or you cannot. And I think there is still quite a long way to go before we get that level of certainty. What AI has a huge potential to do is to start to identify problems before they arise. Let me give just one very practical example. We are increasingly beginning to see IoT devices, trackers being placed on containers. Hapag-Lloyd, for example, now has them on all of their containers. Another problem unrelated to this is we have a lot of fires on board container ships, a lot of that due to misdeclaration of cargo. Now, with trackers on all containers at all points in time, I could have an AI monitor 24/7. Where is that container? So from the point the empty container is picked up in the depot until it's gated in down at the port, where did it go? And if the shipper said, I'm going to ship a container full of T-shirts, but I can see this truck only stopped at the fireworks factory, to make it simple, that's a red flag. So we can start to use AI to make sense of these enormous arrays of data we're going to get to actually try to predict some of the problems that we've been unable to otherwise cope with.
As you rightly say, it's going to take on a lot of the mundane, the sort of workhorse sort of jobs as well. But surely that's also at entry level jobs as well, because
Yes.
in order to get the leaders of the industry, you've got to start at the bottom, haven't you? You can have as many degrees as you like. You've got to come in and you've got to learn that experience. Is AI going to damage that?
No, but what it's going to do is, and you are onto what I think is the most important problem for all shipping lines out there. How do you bridge this gap? Because we're an industry where the normal way into the industry for most people is you get hired in at a junior position. Then you gradually learn how the industry works, how do all the nitty-gritty things work. You get better and better. And ultimately, you're only handling all the complex stuff. If you're cutting out those 5 to 10 years of the early stuff, because now AI is doing it, every company needs to ask itself, how do I bring in new young people and train them so they can go from 0 to 100 miles an hour right away? The companies that crack that code, they will have a massive competitive advantage in the future. And I think right now, a lot of companies are not really taking this seriously enough, because all companies, they have skilled people. Sure, again, being maybe slightly simplistic here, but you can easily go out tomorrow and say, fine, I'm going to fire all my junior people because AI takes it over and I got all the senior people I need. That is great. But what then happens 5 to 10 years from now when you need to have new senior people and you have zero pipeline of people and no way of training new people? So the companies that take this challenge serious, how do you hire in people to go from no skills to a high degree of skills in a very, very short amount of time? That will be the core competitive advantage.
Talking on skills, what have you, I wanted to come talk a little bit about, before we end, on the Copenhagen Business School and certainly the work there of the Blue MBA and what have you. Can you just, what's been your involvement with the CBS? I mean, how have you been involved, and what are your views on the role it's played in sort of educating forward-thinking CEOs like yourself? Because, I mean, its alumni, it's got a very impressive set of alumni from Copenhagen, the business school itself, and certainly, is seen as one of the leading sort of maritime education institutes. But what are your thoughts on it? Give me your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I've been involved with the Blue MBA over at CBS for, I think it's roughly 15 years or so. And mind you, I am only one amongst a whole host of very, very skilled lecturers that cover all the different aspects of shipping. I'm then typically also involved in providing coaching to some of the students in terms of all the assignments they do along the way, as well as being an examiner towards their final exam. And what I tend to see across all the different participants I've come across in these 15 years is a very high degree of motivation, precisely to understand in deeper terms, how does this industry work? How can you analyze it? So rather than go to the industry with a perspective, this is what my experience and gut feeling tells me, but to get a tool set that allows you to then look at problems also from new angles you might not have considered before. Because as we are getting into this much more complex world, and as we can see here, geopolitics are only increasing the magnitude of the complexity. The ability to then analyze these problems from many different perspectives, also perspectives that you might not necessarily agree with, but they are necessary to look at. That becomes an increasingly crucial skill. And it's a skill that most people are not born with. It's something that you have to learn and then practice. And that's why we have all these different assignments. It is to practice those skills over and over again, so you actually become good at exercising them.
It's interesting, and with a nod to the excellent work that CBS is doing, I remember speaking to one of my contacts when I was editor on Lloyd's List many, many years ago. And this chap was president of, I think it's Vespucci K-Line Europe, and what he didn't know about container shipping, you right on the back of a stamp. And he said to me, he said, Sean, the guy who has the office next to me does my job, but in Vespucci K-Line tanker sector. And I know nothing about tankers. And that sort of just said to me how vast the shipping industry is,
Mhm.
but also how at the time, wouldn't it be good if everybody talked to one another? And I think really what the CBS is doing, and then initiatives like that, is enabling CEOs to share best experience and knowledge right the way across the board of the shipping industry, because you are dealing with an industry that is, soup to chips. I mean, it's massive.
It is. And it's also a matter of sometimes you'll see people that have the perspective that, okay, things seems to be a mess at my company or might be a mess at my industry. And then they come and find out and say, well, it's a mess in all the other companies and all the other industries as well. Not because anything is mismanaged, but simply because this is a very, very unpredictable industry to be in. That's not new. I mean, we've had shipping for centuries and it's always been volatile. It's always been prone to very large swings and very large uncertainties. And again, being part of a group where you find out that, well, it's actually not that I misunderstood anything, but is I got to be better equipped then to how to handle and deal with this. That's where the value is.
And finally, Lars, and thank you so much for your time today. I mean, we've really talked in depth about the geopolitical situation and what's going on. But if you and I were having this conversation in a year's time, what would you like to be telling me, and what do you think you'll be telling me?
I think the two things you asked me for first, I would point to exactly the same things. The two major elements will still be the massive shift driven by demographics across Africa and the Indian subcontinent. The other thing will be AI. Where will we be on the state of wars and geopolitics? That right now is unpredictable. We could throw out some wild predictions on what will happen with the war in the Middle East or Panama, or where will the new unexpected war come up. But I think we can only predict that uncertainty will remain. But the long-term trends in terms of massive shifts in trade patterns because of demography over the next couple of decades, that is a firm feature that we need to deal with as an undercurrent, just as the inevitable increase of the use of AI will be the other one.
Lars, thank you very much indeed for your time today. It's been absolutely fascinating talking to you. I mean, I've learned so much wise words, but thank you very much for spending your time with us today. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.